One of the best things about church is it taps into a sense, a lot of times, especially if you've been in the church for a really long time, it taps into a sense of belonging, of community. There's a nostalgia to it. Like we have these things that we remember when we were younger. I grew up in the '80s in the church, so like occasionally when a hymn pops up and I'm like, oh, that's such a good hymn. I love it. I love when the church that I belong to now pops in a hymn on occasion. I prefer something that is liturgical once in a while. It's not my biggest preference, but I genuinely enjoy something that feels like old church. Now, people like my son, he never really experienced that. So he doesn't really have a preference for that, but he does prefer the lights in the smoke machine, not because of any need to be cool or whatever, but because that's what he knows. So when us older people, and now I'm 44, I get that there's other people that are older in my audiences, but we remember what it was like to worship God through these things, through hymns and through spiritual songs, or better yet, in the '80s and to the '90s, we would open up that purple or tan book, the Maranatha book, and sing praise songs, and then we started replacing church pews on the stage for the choir with drums and things. None of these things are necessarily wrong, but it's in our heart and how we go about doing it. And that's the thing. Pastors have to communicate why they're changing things, and then we have to understand why the pastors are doing that, right? But we get into so many church fights be over preferences. Now we all have the preferences. Like I said, there's some churches that are holy rollers speaking in tongues. That's something that I don't do. I don't prefer. I don't like. I would never go to a church like that because I have my preferences and my beliefs on what scripture says about all of that kind of stuff. That's my preference. It's not something I need to fight over. We can clarify and have debate and discussion. Somebody that came from a Catholic background that comes into the church that I go to would be like, what is happening? I prefer going through all these incantations and these prayers and these stand up, sit down things that are so foreign to maybe evangelical people. I don't really ever use that term, but just to relate to what I'm speaking about. The Protestant churches. Now, I grew up in a church tradition that it's called the Restoration Movement, and what it was intended to get away from the Baptist model from the 1800s, to get away from the highbrow churches, and to really try to connect back with what the first century Christians did and experienced as Christians, as Christ followers, as worshipers. And so their intent, now it always becomes like Disciples of Christ splits off with that and becomes this and that. We have preferences of carpet colors. And I literally worked at a church where they split back in, I think it was the 50s, maybe the 60s, over carpet color. That's not good. That's not good for anybody. But we fight so much about preferences rather than getting into the word and saying, what does this mean to us? Preferences will kill a church. It can sustain a church, but it can also kill a church if we're not careful with our forked tongues, with our tongues that spit venom at each other because we're so mad that they are not reaching us where we are. And pastors do a disservice to their congregation if they're not listening to the preferences of the people to a point. Like, hey, we're going to lead you this way because we really believe that this is the future. But if you don't communicate that and you just assume that we understand that from the congregation sitting there, and you've had myriads of meetings and how this is going to go, and you've met with the elders, and you've never ever communicated the preference that you're changing, you're going to destroy your church over something so trivial as carpet color or a fog machine or a LED screen, whatever it is. We tend to fight really, really hard for the things that we prefer. We see that mirrored in all of society. We see that in how our churches are reflective of our culture. Notice in the American church or the Western church that a lot of the woke crowd, the leftist crowd, is doing this deconstruction thing, really tearing down the church and hurting us. because they're calling out all too often, they're calling out these behaviors. And all too often, a lot of deconstructionists are not necessarily concerned about what the Bible is saying or how it, but it's how it's being portrayed to society. Now, that's a blanket statement for the deconstruction movement, which I think is a danger to churches. It's destructive in the way that it's going about it and being propagated through social media. But in our preferences, we tend to reflect culture as well. So in our church, our Western church culture, we've built these things up because it looks like corporate world. Is it any wonder that our church in the Western culture specifically is built on a corporate structure? No, I don't even think that's necessarily wrong. You go over to another Asian church. It's very blanket statement. It's very much not corporate. Or if it is corporatized, it's because it's been influenced by Western missionaries. It's not necessarily wrong either. But our preferences, because we prefer this style of worship, doesn't look around the people around us and say, how can we reach these people? Instead, we stick our foot in the mud and say, no, we're not adding drums. No, we are not going to add X, Y, Z. And we hurt ourselves and our growth in our community, and we hurt the church as pastors because we know what is best. And instead of just taking the time to simply communicate why we're doing the things that we're doing, we got rid of the choir that has been there since the founding of the church 50 years ago. And you hurt 200 people that are part of the congregation, and they leave because they preferred the choir. Now, was that really the core issue? No, it was because the communication was so terrible in that process that they didn't feel like they could trust you to present them or to lead them any longer. So yes, preferences are king to a point in churches, especially in the Western church. Like, we prefer the way that we do. If not, well, I'm going to go over to this other church. And it dominates the way we do things. And it's not wrong to have preferences, but it is wrong if we get so stuck and mired in our preferences that we don't allow for the Spirit to move in our congregation and messages coming through the computer. Hey, I've got some new merch available. You can find a link on my link tree. My name is Paul Procise. If you've never seen me before, I appreciate you. We'll see you soon.